Hi, I'm Bill Schmick. Welcome to 30 Minutes. Hi, I'm Bill Schmick, and welcome back to 30 Minutes. Today we're going to talk about education. No, don't roll your eyes. Education in this country is a big topic in today's world. Are schools in this country really on the right track? Are they really preparing our kids for a future in this country? And if they are, what is education's goals and objectives? Think about that for a moment. What is education's goal today? Can you answer that? Mostly when I ask people that, they scratch their head and they say, well, to get a job or to get educated. Very interesting answer to that question. And then, of course, we talk about college. How much it costs to go to college today, how much parents are putting out, how much debt the student gets into for what. The question might be, should we even go to college? Or if we are going to college, should colleges be free? Anyway, we're going to be exploring these topics, not only now, but we'll have a second part after this. So, take me for example. I've got a daughter, Jackie. She's 35 years old, and I consider myself lucky because she got out of school in 2002, college, okay? But I looked back, and from the day she was born in 1980 until she graduated from college in 2002, do you realize that college costs had grown 400%? And I consider myself lucky because prices have increased so much more. Actually, they are increasing 6.6% a year for tuition, not counting school, books or accommodations or anything else. Americans actually spend $100 billion a year sending 14 million college students each year to school. Can you afford it? I think that rapidly only the 1% of Americans anymore in this country could afford to send their kids to college. When I look over at the numbers, 44% of students in this country pay about $9,000 a year in tuition. Now, you might not think that's bad unless, like 50% of American wage earners, you're only making $50,000 a year. And if you are, $9,000 a year is a lot of money. Now, 28% attend private nonprofit colleges, and they're spending probably $36,000 a year, quite a big difference between the 9 and the 36. Now, how much does government chip in for this each year? About $178 billion, that's right. Government is spending about $178 billion to put your kids through school. The average student receives about $12,500 a year in tuition, grants, and they only need to repay about half of that money. Of all student loans, programs, grants, tax rates, etc., the government probably is paying almost half of American kids' tuitions a year. So it doesn't sound that bad. But if I look back and talk to people about their situation and their children's situation, I get a different story. For example, I was getting a flu shot this year, and my local pharmacist who was giving me the flu shot, he was talking to me about education. And his assistant came up and she said, she knew that I wrote columns and so forth, and she said, listen, what do? I have 2 kids. One, a girl who is graduating from college. Right now, she's in $40,000 in debt, and her major is in English literature, and she can't find a job, okay? And even if she could find the job, she'll never pay off her debt, at least for the next 10, 15 years, given the wage she's getting. And she said, and then there's my son, who's now in graduate school, and he's got almost $75,000 in debt. And he can't find a job wherever. And I said, well, what did he major in? And she said, well, art. And I said, art? What do you mean art? And she said, well, he's a photographer, and he's trying to find a job as a photographer. And I looked at her and I said, well, you're a smart woman. Did you give any advice to your 2 children as they were growing up as to how they were going to make a living? Well, they love what they do. And I said, well, they love what they do, but loving what they do is not going to get them out of debt, nor is it going to earn them a living wage in this country. He said, yeah, I know. What can I tell them? And so here's the dilemma in this country. Now, I have another person, local person, who also reminded me, and he's right, that let's take his children. Let's say they also are creating $50,000 in debt in student loans, etc. He reminded me that student debt is, you can't declare bankruptcy in student debt. That is one area that you owe and you will owe for a lifetime. And worse, let's say, and this has happened before, let's say your son or your daughter comes to you and borrows the money from you, or that you become a co-signer for their debt. Well, that's going to create a credit score, a bad credit score for you. And not only that, if your child, and you don't know what's going to happen to your child, something happens and he can't pay the debt, that burden is on you for the rest of your life. And it follows you, whether you're trying to get a mortgage or a car payment. You know, $50,000 of unpaid debt is something very heavy to hang around your neck. So, if you think about it, today we have college students graduating after 4 years in college with $50,000 or $30,000 in debt, can't find a job, and then end up working for minimum wage at McDonald's or some other fast food companies. This seems to me a crazy turn of events in this country. And I wondered, how have we gotten into this mess? So now I want to give you a bit of a history lesson on education in this country. Do you know that the first school in this country was established in 1635 by the Puritans? That's right, about 35, 40 years after they settled in America. They started the first college, well, we'll call it the first school, the Boston Latin School in Boston. And it was the first free public school. Now, what was the purpose or the goal? The goal was to perpetuate the Puritan faith. That's basically the idea. Was now that the Puritans had built a village and could look further afield, the first thing they wanted to do is for the young, the qualified young, to learn the languages, learn about spirituality and their religions. Now, as far as public education is concerned, Tom Jefferson was probably the first of our founding fathers who actively sought and proposed a public education system. And his reasoning was fairly accurate. I mean, not only did he want to perpetuate faith in general, but he also wanted the public at that time to be voters and to be law-abiding citizens as well. So from his point of view, the public good could be served by a public education. And then there was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin actually, I guess you could say, he established the first high school or secondary school. He did that in Philadelphia. It was called the American Academy in 1751. Now, Ben, as you know, was a pretty smart businessman. So he built on the goals and objectives, the building blocks so far in America in education. And remember, that was faith, was the first. And then Jefferson wanted to unite society and also prevent crime and poverty. And he thought education would develop good citizenship. And then Ben Franklin, who was very, very aware that in Europe, the Industrial Revolution had started and was starting to move over into America. He thought by establishing a secondary school, he could add to those other goals skilled workers. He thought that the secondary school, the high school, might be able to produce workers that could work in American factories and industrialize this country. But it wasn't really until the 20th century before high schools took off at all. Up until that time, you know, the little red schoolhouse, whatever on the prairie, where the children would get the 3 R's of education when they didn't have to work on the farm or the ranch at home. That sort of education was what really worked in America until, as I said, the 20th century. And it was only then, in the beginning of the 20th century, that the majority of states made education compulsory for students 16 and younger. So what happened in this country? From early 1900s to, say, 1996, their percentage of teenage high school grads increased from, say, 6% to 85% in America. Now, the education purpose also widened at the same time. So, as Franklin was right, the Industrial Revolution drove a lot of the primary and secondary education. And so we moved from faith, good citizenship, people who vote, to providing a skilled labor force that could now capture the American dream. So that was basically the 1900s. And it succeeded. But remember, it was a building block situation. So what happened then? Well, we had World War I, and then we had World War II. And in America, we'll stick with World War II because that's really where things started to change. By 1945, 16 million Americans, 1 in 8, were somehow employed by the U.S. government and serving their country in World War II. And in 1944, a year before that, Congress, this time a little bit more farsighted than they usually are, established the GI Bill of Rights. And they learned their lesson because after World War I, when all those GIs came home, there were riots, there were protests from these military vets who couldn't find a job, who couldn't have a house. They determined in Congress that this time around in World War II, that wouldn't happen. And the GI Bill of Rights did a number of things. It provided for unemployment. It provided for easy loans for houses. It provided for business loans. And most important for us, it provided a free college education. And 8 million vets came home and went to college. It was a stupendous success. The illiteracy rate in this country dropped to 3%. That was the lowest it has ever been in history. Now, at the same time, it coincided with sort of the end of the industrial age, the factory age, and the beginning of the industrial military complex in this country. Technocracy is another name for it, and the dawning of the information age. Just as all these seasoned veterans went in to get a college education. And America, as you know, exploded. Growth exploded in this country, the population did, housing, factories, we became the greatest country on earth. And we rode that wave, and the colleges rode that wave. But even up to the 1950s, only 18% of Americans actually went to college. So what happened? 1957 happened. Remember, after World War II, the Cold War started. The Cold War between us and the Soviet Union for the dominance of the world. Democracy against communism. Well, if you recall, some of you might, I remember in my grammar school having to hide under the desk in case there was a nuclear attack from the Soviets. We relied on building up our Navy, our Air Force, our Army against their Navy, Army, and the ballistic missiles and then the nuclear missiles. All of that started to occur. And then in October of 1957, the worst thing imaginable could happen for this country. The Russians launched Sputnik, the first satellite, the first into space. And that horrified the world, the democratic world, and scared the United States white. So as a response to that, John F. Kennedy and his administration decided that we were now in a new space race. And the way to win the space race was knowledge, education, science, technology, engineering. And so we came to the conclusion that college would be the answer for the American people. And so almost overnight, college became America's patriotic duty. The White House, the administration put up many, many ads exhorting the United States population to go to school and make America and the rest of the world free for democracy. Okay, the idea was that with armies of new engineers and scientists and mathematicians, we could outthink the Soviets, and in the space race, we could beat them. And our fear was, of course, that somehow the Soviets would put nuclear weapons on the Sputniks and be able to fire down into America, and we would be defenseless. So that's what began to happen. Anyone that could go to college should go to college. So with the government, and the government was also pitching to us that anyone who went to college, and at the time this was true, could make double or triple what they could as a high school student. So just legions of Americans decided to go to college. And what happened was those who couldn't afford it, they were taken care of by the federal, state, and local educational systems. And grants and loans to students doubled, and then doubled again, and then quadrupled after that. And with all this money flowing into the educational systems, obviously, universities and colleges started to sprout up in every state, sucking up all of this money the federal government was dumping onto America for education. So college enrollment exploded. Research grants, teachers doubled and doubled again and tripled. Teaching was, again, one of the growth industries in this country. And so a whole generation of students, whether they were qualified or not, went to college. Those who probably would have been better off in a blue-collar kind of job, no, they dropped that, went to college. In fact, what happened was that the vocational schools in this country were decimated. It was at the same time that unions were also on the downturn. And unions, remember, was one of the main schools for teaching skilled blue-collar, engineers, either in auto factories, plumbers, electricians, etc. So you had the unions declining, and you had vocational schools shutting their doors while everybody went to college. And the attitude of Americans in this country were, just like the government wanted, you were not only not patriotic if you went to a blue-collar skill, but there must have been something not wrong with you up here. Maybe you just weren't smart enough to get into college, even with the open door policy. And so those who had blue-collar skills and so forth were looked down upon more and more in American society. And that wasn't justified. It's just the way things happen. So, what changed? Well, nothing for 10 or 11 years. You had the colleges burgeoning. Students, whether they were qualified or not, was in college. And about the same time, Vietnam War. The Vietnam War hit, okay? And as you recall, guess where the center of anti-war sentiment in this country evolved from? Colleges. So the colleges became hotbeds of anti-war protests, and it got worse and worse. Now also, if you recall, the draft. If you were in college, you were exempted from the draft. And even better, if you were graduating from college and you went and became a teacher, you were also exempted from the draft. So suddenly, from patriotism and everybody should go to college, now we have don't fight in an unjust war in Vietnam, go to college. Whether, again, you should or you should not. And worse, become a teacher. Whether you could or you wanted to or not, become a teacher and be exempt from the draft. And so here we had a situation where federal and state governments were pouring all this money into these colleges, and the college students and the teachers themselves were then using the money to stay in school, avoid the draft, and protest against an unpopular war. And from the federal and state point of view, who were waging this war, something had to give, and it did. In 1966, the California gubernatorial campaign, Ronald Reagan, who pointed out to the public, the conservative public at the time, the pro-war public, that we were paying all these students in all these colleges around the country to protest against the war. He won that governorship, and when he did, he went to the California school system and began to pull back on the money that that school system was getting from the federal and the state government. The federal government followed suit. And then before we know it, across the nation, the government was pulling money out of the schools, cutting off the grants, cutting off the loans from the students in an attempt to reduce the anti-war sentiment. Well, it was a terrible blow to the university system. Okay, they were no longer getting the government grants. They had to start to hike tuitions. It still wasn't enough. Remember, they built all these colleges all over the country. And so they had to start cutting back on the teachers. Well, for the teachers, who were pretty well paid at that time and had pretty good fringe benefits, to see their jobs being dismissed and possibly having to go to Vietnam as well, started to organize and form their own unions. And that somewhat slowed their attrition rate. But what it did also at the same time, it sort of changed the attitude towards teachers from Americans who, seeing and not understanding why they were unionizing and seeing on the other side the unions in America, the truckers and the machinists and so forth, those unions being decimated, and there was a lot of unsavory elements in some of the unions in this country at the time. And so the attitude towards American teachers became sort of like becoming blue-collar workers. And if you were conservative and for the war, you were looking at these teachers as also unpatriotic. So the situation during the Vietnam Wars drastically changed. Okay, so here you have Reagan, the other teachers organizing into unions, educational loans and grants and so forth going by the wayside. And you also have to recall that in, I think it was 1962, we had the issue of school prayer, okay? And so therefore, at that time, because of the Supreme Court, faith as a goal and objective of the education system went by the wayside. Now let's think for a minute about those goals and objectives. You know, the building blocks that we talked about from the Puritan days until now. Well, faith was the first. School prayer knocked out that goal and objective of the American education system. Then we had the Vietnam War. All right, so good citizens, well, education was supposed to be teaching us to become good citizens, but from the experience of the Vietnam War, as far as students are concerned, good citizenship meant what? Going over to Vietnam and killing defensive Vietnamese. So the whole question of being a good citizen, voting, obeying authority went by the wayside as well. So now we have faith gone, and we have, because of the Vietnam War, we have citizens decided to reject the law, protest and so forth. They didn't believe anymore in authority as the schools had been dictating it. And as far as the Industrial Revolution and the technocracy and so forth that had occurred, were the colleges actually teaching our students to go out and help in this technocracy and information age? No, it was actually, the whole deal was to avoid the draft or to go to college basically because it was almost free. So what my argument is that along the way somehow the goals and purposes of our educational system started to atrophy and disappear. So what has replaced that? What has replaced our educational system's goals now? Let's fast forward 50 years. And let's look at some fairly alarming statistics. 32 million adults in the United States, 14% of the population can't read. 21% of adults read below the 5th grade level. 19% of high school grads can't read. The illiteracy rate hasn't changed in this country in 10 years. And as you know, crime in high schools and even grammar schools and colleges is increasing. The next time, what we're going to be talking about is how we can change the system, what is happening in colleges today, and a big question is, should colleges be free? So tune in for the next time, and see you then. Thank you.